This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Welcome to another episode of the Hindus in Focus podcast. I'm Zubaida Hamid, your host for today. It's hard to imagine a world without plastic now. Plastic exists in almost every sphere of our life. Microplastics, the tiny toxic particles that plastics shed and that are scattered across the environment, have been found everywhere, from clouds to the bottom of the ocean, in Antarctica, and even in our bodies. We swallow them and we breathe them in. In a recent study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, however, researchers found microplastics and nanoplastics, which are even smaller particles, inside our innermost organ, in the fatty deposits or plaques that can accumulate in the blood vessels of the heart. They also found that those with these plastics in their blood vessels had a greater risk of experiencing heart attacks, strokes, or death. However, they have cautioned that this was only a link and not proof that plastics led to bad health. Much more research is needed to establish how plastics really affect our bodies. The study comes at a time when the world and India is attempting to ban plastic and encourage people towards sustainable plastic-free options. But this is happening very slowly, as we can see all around us in daily life and in the massive landfills of our city. What can micro and nanoplastics do to the human body? What is the direction research into this must take? And how can we minimize our exposure to plastic pollution? We delve into these questions and more with Dr. Sanjay Rajagopalan, one of the authors of the study and Chief Cardiovascular Medicine and Chief Academic and Scientific Officer at University Hospitals, Harrington Heart and Vascular Institute, Ohio, the United States. Welcome to the Hindus in Focus podcast, Dr. Sanjay Rajagopalan.
It's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Zubaida.
Doctor, talk to us about your study and explain to us what you found.
This is a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is perhaps one of the first studies to link plastics, microplastics in particular, which are, if you want to call it, fragments of plastics or breakdown components of plastics. And these are very, very small components. So microplastics are typically less than 1 micron in diameter. And for those of our listeners, this is the diameter, which is much smaller than the diameter of a hair follicle. So what we did was to really understand whether or not microplastics and nanoplastics, which are much, much smaller fragments, if you will, are associated with heart attacks and strokes. And for those of our listeners who might not know this, cardiovascular diseases encompass the spectrum of heart attack, stroke, which is a major cause of death and disability throughout the world. And in fact, is a leading cause of death and disability in the world, and certainly in India as well. So in this study, we enrolled 304 participants. And the idea was to see whether these plastics or microplastics and nanoplastics penetrate and accumulate in tissues in the human body. Now, we do know from prior studies that these smaller fragments of plastics find their way into the biosphere and certainly have penetrated the human biosphere. And that what I mean is these plastics find their way into tissues of the body. In particular, they've been known to accumulate in tissues such as the fat, the brain, the liver, and the gastrointestinal system. Now, what we did not know is that these plastics also accumulate within what we call cardiovascular tissues, namely the blood vessels, as well as the heart. So in this study, we enrolled participants who were undergoing a surgery referred to as carotid endarterectomy. And what this means is when a blockage develops in the artery feeding the brain, the carotid artery is a major artery feeding blood supply to the brain. There is a blockage that forms, and when it gets to be about 80% or more of blockage, surgeons open up the neck with a small incision. They expose the carotid artery. They open up the carotid artery using a very small incision, and they clean out the blockage, right? And I think most of our listeners will sort of understand the concept. When a blockage builds, one of the thoughts is it limits blood flow, therefore you clean out the blockage. Then they took the tissue that they extracted from within the carotid artery and subjected it to some important, highly sensitive measurements, including electron microscopy. And what they found was that there was indeed accumulation of two types of plastics. One is polyethylene, which all of our readers know, listeners know, are components that are ubiquitous in the environment. So these are components of plastic bottles, wraps, containers, etc. Roughly 58% of patients, and there were a total of 150 patients who had evidence of polyethylene, which is roughly 58% of the population, and roughly 12% of patients had measurable amounts of polyvinyl chloride. Polyvinyl chloride, or PVC for short, is again a component of plastic pipes, very, very commonly used. And then what they did was to follow these patients over a duration of 3 years just to see if those who accumulated plastics, now there were patients who did not accumulate plastics as well, right? So they compared those who accumulated plastics within the carotid artery versus patients who did not accumulate plastics. And what they found was those who had plastics within the carotid artery had roughly fourfold higher incidence of heart attacks and stroke than those who did not accumulate plastics. So that, in summary, is this observation. Importantly, this is an association study. In other words, there is an association, but we all know that association does not always mean causation. So there needs to be a lot more studies that need to understand this finding that we have and try to shed light on what the plastics are doing there. What if any other mechanisms, or how do they cause, if they cause strokes, for instance, or heart attacks, how do they do that? So that, in a sense, is a summary of the study.
Thanks, doctor. That was very clear. Tell us, you have said that microplastics have been found in the human body in in various kinds of tissues before. They have been found in the bottom of the ocean. They have been found in clouds. Was your finding unexpected, or were you anticipating finding plastics in the blood vessels of the heart?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. The author of the study, my good friend Rafaela Marfella, obviously had an inclination or a notion that plastics might be indeed detected within tissues, right? So his hypothesis was simply to test the idea that this might indeed be the case, and he had a strong suspicion based on the fact that plastics have been found in the ecosystem, the biosphere, in large amounts, and this has been an observation of numerous papers prior to this, where they are essentially found widely in the biosphere, right? So they accumulate in the marine ecosystem. We know that they've been found in environments as isolated as Antarctica, for instance. So they are widespread, and all of the plastics wind up ultimately in the oceans. They have penetrated fish stocks, animal ecosystems, and certainly, I think the food we consume very likely have a component of plastics in it, because once you um, once you use plastics in close proximity to foods, and you know as well as I do that today's society, when we consume foods, it's almost always in a plastic container. So it's very likely that it finds its way into the food. And once you ingest food, it gets into your gastrointestinal tract, and from there it gets absorbed into the bloodstream. But for these particles that are so tiny, it's very likely that they find their way into the bloodstream. So yeah, I think investigators in this team, led by Dr. Marfella, had a very strong inclination or suspicion that plastics indeed might be found in cardiovascular tissues.
Tell us a little bit about the link. Previous research has suggested that microplastics can increase inflammation. Could you explain this to us?
Yeah, so let's talk about what this idea of inflammation is and what its link might be to heart attacks and stroke. Now, many decades ago, a scientist and a group of scientists came up with the idea that lipoproteins, which are components in your blood that carry cholesterol, and these are proteins that essentially transport cholesterol in your blood, came up with the idea that these lipoproteins can deposit fats into the blood vessel, resulting in formation of what we call obstruction or stenosis. Stenosis is a medical word for a blockage, right? And the idea was that there is passive accumulation of cholesterol and other junk that we consume in our diets in the blood vessel wall, resulting in formation of a blockage. And most of us can get this idea very easily that once you get a blockage in a blood vessel, it reduces blood flow, and therefore it might cause symptoms. Now, the other concept that has evolved over the last 20 years is that when you accumulate things that should not be there in the blood vessel wall, and these are, when I'm talking about blood vessels in particular, I'm referring to blood vessels that supply critical organs like the heart or the brain. So, namely, these are the coronary arteries that supply blood flow to the heart, and in the case of the brain, it's the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. So, once you have plaque, which are really lipid material or cholesterol material that accumulates in the blood vessel wall, the body starts to recognize, and these are not just cholesterol, these are modified forms of cholesterol or oxidized forms of cholesterol. The body senses these exogenous component deposits in the blood vessel wall and sort of recognizes them as being alien, as not being native to the blood vessel wall, and starts to attack these components. This is what we refer to as inflammation, where it's the body's response to some kind of injury or a process that occurs that should not be going on. So it's very akin to, let's say, a cut in your finger, and blood vessels migrate from the bloodstream into the tissues of the finger in order to fight off infection. So this concept of inflammation is exactly identical to that. So white cells from within the body migrate to the areas of the blood vessel which have these components of oxidized cholesterol and start attacking it. And the idea is that these blood vessels will eventually resolve this exogenous material and clean up the artery. But this never happens because this process of deposition of cholesterol is ongoing, and there's a relentless positive feedback mechanism where the inflammation begets more inflammation and things just get worse. So this inflammation is believed to be underlying the cause of heart attacks and strokes in many patients. And in fact, we now believe that tackling inflammation with drugs can in fact reduce heart attacks and stroke. And that's exactly what's been shown before, where there are a group of drugs which are anti-inflammatory agents that can fight inflammation and reduce heart attacks and strokes. So when plastics get into the blood vessel wall, they're again sensed as being foreign. The body attacks this foreign entity with white cells, which would descend and sort of migrate into the vessel wall and sets up a process of inflammation, which we ultimately believe can predispose one to heart attacks and strokes.
So, Doctor, as you told us in your first answer, you and your colleagues have said that the presence of microplastics that you found in the plaque does not definitively prove that microplastics cause heart attacks, but this is an area that needs more research and study. So, should plastic pollution feature as a risk factor now for cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far because I think the evidence base that we need to build to demonstrate that there's indeed a causative link between plastics and heart attacks and stroke needs to be built. And usually in medicine, like in other fields, we do that through rigorous studies, which includes both prospective, retrospective studies, as well as detailed mechanistic studies using models. And once we've built up an adequate evidence base, that's really when we can start to make the pivot. But that should not preclude the fact that this should be a major consideration, or at least there should be a thought process and um, ways in which we start to build the evidence base. And more importantly, I think recognize the fact that given the evidence so far, the plastics have permeated um, ecosystems, and they've been found in literally hundreds of species in all major taxa, including humans. And these are studies that have found plastics in tissues other than the cardiovascular systems, we should be very alert to the possibility that wherever possible, and this is history is a precedent, right? We know that when we in the 1990s started recognizing that air pollution might be linked to health effects, people were initially a little bit skeptical because air pollution is extremely unnatural, right? High levels of air pollution are a result of fossil fuel pollution, and air pollution started to influence a number of conditions. And at that time, the link was just merely an associative link. There wasn't the evidence base. But eventually, we now recognize that air pollution is indeed a major risk factor for things like heart attacks and strokes. It is a link for a number of cancers, including lung cancer. And it's also a link for childhood disorders like asthma, respiratory diseases, etc. And it's also been linked to neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, for instance. So this is in many ways a very similar, we find ourselves in a very similar moment where this is the first time that they've found a link between cardiovascular events. And, if I were a betting man, Zubaida, I would say that it's very likely that plastics will be linked to cardiovascular events in the future.
That's a scary prospect, doctor. So tell us a little bit more. I was interested when you said that some of your patients, the patients that you studied, did not have any evidence of microplastics or nanoplastics in the fatty deposits of their blood vessels. Why do you think that difference arose?
Right. Now, this is a great question. And I think the explanation for this is complex. There could be a multiple number of factors that have contributed to this observation. As I mentioned before, this study does have a lot of limitations, and one limitation that I should point out right away is that the patients who had higher levels of plastics also had other risk factors. And when I mean risk factors, I mean risk factors for heart disease. And those risk factors include there were a higher percentage of diabetics in those that had microplastics. In other words, more number of diabetics had microplastics than non-diabetics. Similarly, patients who had more heart disease, in other words, had a history of a heart attack or a stroke before joining the study, had higher levels of plastics. So, what this might mean is that for some reason there could be biological mechanisms where, for some reason, patients with these risk factors accumulate plastics, and that could mean mechanisms such as these patients could be absorbing plastics from the GI system, the gastrointestinal tract, or maybe breathing plastics because that's another route of entry of plastics. For some reason, these patients are probably accumulating plastics much faster than those patients who did not have plastics. So that could be a biological reason. There could also be, social reasons where patients who had higher levels of plastics could perhaps be exposed to conditions where they were perhaps being brought closer to components in their foods or perhaps in what they were inhaling. Somehow they were proximal to these sources, right, compared to those patients who did not accumulate. What I mean by that is perhaps those who accumulated plastics were using more plastic containers. They perhaps were in close proximity to highly polluted regions. One scenario in India that I can think about are waste bins or places where landfills, where waste is dumped. And as we all know, waste in any society is a large component of that is filled with plastics. So if you're living close to a waste landfill, for instance, you might be inhaling higher levels of plastics. So these are non-biological reasons or societal or economic or socioeconomic considerations, let's say, because we know urban poor are often in close proximity to highly polluted regions. They are in close proximity to landfills, unclean areas. So it could be that they were being exposed to higher levels of plastics. So these could be some of the reasons why we saw what we saw.
You said earlier, doctor, that we might be about to witness the same trajectory as we did for air pollution. The link between air pollution and what happens to the human body, and then finally the conclusive proof that air pollution does cause various kinds of diseases and increases your risk for several more. What is the kind of research that you would like to see going forward to be able to potentially link microplastics and nanoplastics to cardiovascular and other diseases?
Well, if you ask me, truthfully so, and even if you examine air pollution as an example, the regulations that were put in place were much before we had strong evidence of health effects. So if you trace back the history of air pollution regulation, at least in the United States, this was in 1972 when the Clean Air Act was passed, right? And similarly in India, I think there are regulations. Many countries recognize that air pollution is bad for you even before strong evidence of health effects. Now, the initial evidence linking air pollution with health effects came from major air pollution episodes. For instance, London had a very bad event, and that led the government to pass regulations saying, look, we cannot accept very high levels of pollution. And this was, maybe one bad air pollution day or several bad air pollution days that resulted in health problems. Similarly, in Delhi, as well as many cities in India, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that high levels of air pollution are bad for you. Now, that's based on simple epidemiologic observations or observations, from a few studies that led to regulations. So we could even say and draw on this analogy between air pollution and say that look, plastics are so ubiquitous, and it's not just the microplastics and nanoplastics. The problem with plastics or beta is also the fact that they have a number of other components, right? Chemical components that are part of the plastics. And that is the problem. And these are chemicals that have been already implicated with a number of health problems. And this includes things like bisphenols, phthalates, forever chemicals like PFAS chemicals. And these are actually components of the plastics themselves. So it's not just the plastics in of itself, but also the associated chemicals that have already been implicated extensively with diseases like cancers, for instance. So we do have evidence that the company that plastics keep is not a good one already and has been associated with a number of health effects. So I do believe that there is enough evidence to pass broad regulation on the utilization of plastics. And indeed, this has been what you've been seeing all around the world, where plastics have been banned in many walks of life. Certainly, there have been warnings about trying to limit the use of plastics wherever possible, right? Now, that's already ongoing. Now, before you say something like plastics are a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, I think we need to be a little bit more careful, because I don't think we want our listeners to start, running around telling others that, look, plastics are causing heart attacks, and that can be extremely inappropriate at this point in time. And what I mean is we need a body of studies. And your question was, what other types of studies we can do? I think there needs to be a number of epidemiological studies. And what I mean by that is prospective, careful collection of data on heart attacks, strokes, and other cardiovascular events with plastic accumulation, whether you measure plastics in the environment in close proximity to patients or plastics within tissues in the body. Now, these are hard studies to do, right? Just imagine soliciting a participant to say, look, I'm going to take a piece of tissue from you and I'm going to study whether or not plastics are within it. Nobody's going to volunteer for such studies. But there are opportunities in what I refer to as opportunistic studies, where you could potentially collect tissues in patients undergoing surgery for other reasons. And you can study those tissues and come up with, observations. Those also should be supplemented with studies in other ecosystems, maybe in fish and other animals, and linking them to health problems in those ecosystems. So we need to build the evidence. And once we do that, I think we'll be in a much better place to confidently say or advise the public regarding the links between cardiovascular events and plastics.
Final question, Doctor. What would you advise? So, while we know that now there is an association, it's not quite proof yet, and perhaps we will get there soon. What would you, in general, suggest to people who have, say, risk or already have risk factors for heart disease, who have already had a heart issue, and the general public with regard to minimizing their exposure to plastics?
Look, it's quite simple. I think we really need to rediscover simpler ways of living, right? Now, it's inevitable that living in modern society, it's almost impossible to think of life without plastics, in the sense that most of our household components, the chairs that we sit in, the tables that we consume our food in, are probably have some components of plastic if they're not made of wood. The plastics are so ubiquitous in our environment. But where we can start to eschew and sort of reduce their usage is in things like food containers, for instance, where wherever possible we can substitute this with reusable containers like glass, made out of glass, or even stainless steel, which is commonly used in India, right? And there's an advantage of doing that. One is it reduces your plastic exposure. Plastic doesn't come in contact with your food. Secondly, it's much cheaper to keep using the same dishes again rather than getting a plastic container from a restaurant, let's say, right? Because people might not recognize this. There is a cost of doing that. There is a societal cost of doing that. You might not see that in your bill, but you can be sure that's being passed on to you by the person selling you the item. So that's one way to start. Consuming water, for instance, maybe carry a stainless steel container, or reduce your plastic bottles. Do not buy a plastic bottle containing water when you go on a trip. Maybe fill your own pitcher and take that to use. It's a much cheaper way of doing it rather than purchasing plastic bottles. Now, that would be a first step. In addition, I think there is a societal challenge for companies and other contributors to plastic pollution to rethink ways in which they could reduce plastic usage and come up with paper, other cardboard, or other forms of containers that perhaps would give you less exposure to plastic. So I think there are ways in which we can start to pivot to a much more reasonable way. Again, acknowledging the fact that there are areas of modern living that will entail usage of plastics, but the game could be to try and reduce aspects of human exposure that we think are, prominent right now, which is oral absorption as well as inhalational exposure. Inhalational exposure is much more difficult because these particles are again present in the air you breathe, and unless you reduce air pollution in general and reduce plastic disposal into the environment at large, it's not going to go away. So this again goes back to, at least in India, what we all need to do, which is to reduce air pollution exposure. And that starts by reducing fossil fuel consumption, by moving to renewable forms of energy. And when that happens, I think there will be a vicious cycle where, since petrochemicals are the major source of plastics to begin with, when you reduce your usage of petrochemicals, you'll automatically reduce the production of plastics. And when you reduce the production of plastics, you're going to reduce the consumption of plastics. I hope this answer was at least provides our listeners a little bit of guidance.
For sure. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Dr. Rajagopalan.
Thank you, Zubaida. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and our listeners today.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.